Hello and welcome to asiCast number 167. We're now in the run-up to our conference in Nice this November, and I'm delighted to welcome to the podcast one of the speakers at our audio and radio conference, Matt Deegan, who is Director of Folder Media and Podcast Discovery. So welcome, Matt.
Hello, Richard.
Now, very attentive listeners may recall that Matt hosted asiCast number 124 when he interviewed Matt Hill of Radio Player about developments in in-car audio. This time, Matt gets to be the interviewee himself. So he's a well-known figure in UK radio to the extent he was recently made a fellow of the Radio Academy. And in Nice, he'll be talking about how to launch podcasts in an extremely crowded marketplace. Now, talking of the sheer volume of podcasts out there, Matt, in a recent blog, you looked at the recently launched Edison podcast Ranker in the UK that attempted for the first time to do some sort of podcast chart. And you highlighted some of the challenges that attempts to put those charts together face. What do you think are the specific issues in attempting to measure and compare the audience to different podcasts?
It's interesting. So there's a few different ways that around the world people measure podcasts. Clearly, if you're a podcast owner, you know how many downloads you got from your hosting company. The big issue is that people don't tend to share that information. Or particularly in the UK, they don't share that information. Around the world, there are podcast rankers where groups together have agreed to share data, particularly in the Nordics, in Australia, in America. But even those podcast rankers are incomplete because not everybody plays. So you might be number one in a ranker, but a big operator might not be involved. Then what you have is what Edison have done in the UK, and they've been previously doing in the US, is they've done their own survey. So basically they've asked hundreds or thousands of podcast listeners, what have you listened to in the last week? And use that to create a ranker, which is what's just been released in the UK. Now that's not bad because it kind of everybody's involved, whether they want to be or not. And looking at the data that's come through, it seems pretty good. The trouble with those survey-based systems, though, is that because podcasting has a really long tail, you need a very large sample size to kind of capture audience. And whilst big shows, of course, are at one end, it drops off pretty quickly. So it can be difficult to capture the right mix of listeners to get the right sort of list.
I guess that you highlight one of the challenges is that a download does not always mean a play. I mean, I subscribe to about 30 podcasts, but a number of them are just download, see if I'm interested in, if not, move on to the next one. So it's a very similar challenge that TV has, which is how do you measure the long tail of content when allegedly 1 million podcasts were launched in the pandemic, and I don't know how many of them survived the pandemic, but certainly people had time on their hands. And certainly with that sheer volume of podcasts out there, you're going to be talking about podcast discovery. So how can podcasts, without giving away your whole conference speech, but perhaps a few framing thoughts on how can podcasts best launch themselves into what is an incredibly crowded marketplace, often with hardly any marketing budget?
Yeah, I mean, I think the challenge for podcasts is the same challenge that any content companies have about driving awareness and then trial. A lot of the things that have worked in marketing for the last 50 years are as equally as applicable to podcasting as they are to other products. And I think you have to start with your audience. Where are your audience? Where do they live? Where do they live digitally? Where do they live physically? And how are you able to reach them, and building a plan which identifies those people and how you can go after them. I think there's some kind of podcast specific things, like the best way to reach a podcast listener is on another podcast. At least you know that if you're talking to somebody through a podcast, they're a podcast listener. They're available to listen to your show. There's no wastage with that. And so podcast advertising, live read talk ups, guest swaps, those sorts of things can be a very useful way to establish some awareness about your podcast with potential listeners. Obviously, social and video is important for everybody, and particularly in podcasting. And you've got the big tech companies, so TikTok and YouTube, having a big push into podcasting this year. YouTube now is YouTube Music is a way to listen to podcasts. So is your show there, even just the audio show, before you get into video versions of shows? And then also on TikTok, video clips have been very good for driving awareness of shows, and they're about to introduce the ability for you to click through from TikTok videos to listen to full episodes. So having a video strategy and a social strategy is very important. We often think, it's that age-old marketing thing of someone's got to hear about your product from 7 or 8 different sources before they then kind of go for a trial. And that's one of our jobs at Podcast Discovery, is to make those things happen. So that might be social media and video, that might be traditional PR, that might be pay for advertising, that might be guest swaps. And we just work to ensure that listeners are able to hear about your show and to then encourage them to sample it.
I guess another key area is distribution. I mean, you mentioned earlier on in the podcast rankers, whether some platforms play ball or not, because typically podcasts are on more than one platform. But I know that there's been some moves by some companies like the BBC to try and make content exclusive to their platform. I'm guessing the main objective being that by doing that, you do know who's downloading your podcast and can build a direct relationship with them. On the other hand, of course, you are forcing people to be in different apps for different podcasts and might get forgotten if they're not in your particular app. What sort of advice would you give your clients around? Is it best to be completely platform neutral, available everywhere, or are there advantages in cultivating a data-rich relationship, I guess you call it, on a particular platform?
I mean, it really depends what your objectives are. If your objectives are to reach the largest number of listeners, maybe you're in an ad-funded operation, then being on every platform is very important. If you're about driving consumption of your app and bringing users to that app, then having a kind of walled garden strategy is probably a good idea. If you see the BBC do this with some of their shows, Spotify historically had a lot of originals which only existed in Spotify, but they're now moving to being more of an advertising platform. So you've started to see a lot more of their shows now available for everybody on the sort of open podcast networks. So it sort of depends really what you want to achieve. I think for the BBC, there's a lot of discussion from them in radio and television about them wanting to know all of the data about all of their consumers. And that's why they don't want their content sort of in as many third-party platforms as they used to. I'm not sure they entirely agree with that, or whether it's entirely necessary for the reasons they state. If you've got data from 10 or 15% of your audience at scale, adding another 30, 40, 50, 70, 80% is not going to change a lot about what you know about those audiences. I think, if I'm being brutal about it, I think the true reason they want people to be on BBC Sounds, and having BBC Sounds be a successful platform is important internally. I think it's probably more about their challenges inside the corporation rather than for listeners. There is also a thing about attribution, and particularly public broadcasters over Europe have this, that if their shows are available in Apple or Spotify, I think some of their research has shown that listeners don't recognize where that material's come from, and that it's been made for by the BBC or DR or Radio France or something like that. So that they kind of face their own challenges. But I think it's really about what the objectives of those operators are.
Mm. Now, in the joint session in Nice, where we're joined at the end of the radio and audio day by the video and TV delegates, we're going to be talking about, amongst other topics, the opportunities that AI offered, particularly generative AI around the generation of content, which is, I know, something you've also been talking about recently on your blog, which we'll put a link to the blog in the show notes, and also your weekly newsletter. I mean, it was quite interesting. You gave a very good example of how AI was being already used in audio production, and it wasn't necessarily in the huge global companies. It was in sort of more in community radio. Can you give us an example of that, and how, whether you think it's perhaps audio's ahead of the curve in AI compared to video, because it's arguably easier to do in audio than it is for a full video production?
I think like lots of places, small organizations sometimes have the freedom to experiment with this stuff a little quicker, or aren't so concerned about rules internally, or what they should be doing as a corporation. So some community radio stations in the UK have been using AI voices to read their news bulletins. And it's sort of interesting, community radio tends to be volunteer-led. They don't always have great voices to read the news. They have more people kind of sort of scripting the news. And so they're using a system which brings together kind of news feeds. They just have their own news feeds. They're not using third parties. And then they've sampled the voice of one of their news readers, and then the AI voice reads out the news. It's pretty good. It sounds pretty good. I played it to my wife. I didn't tell her what she was listening to, and she couldn't sort of tell off the cuff that it was an AI voice until we pointed it out afterwards. And I think some of the AI voices are getting excellent, and I've been playing with a few, and I think they can do a certain job. I think where we'll see it for bigger radio groups is probably for things around personalization, around localization. So you might get a local presenter or a network national presenter doing a local weather bulletin, but that's actually driven by an AI version of them rather than themselves having to pre-record it. You might see that for travel news, for things like that. For sort of essential information, I don't see it like replacing the quality of the DJ. Though Spotify are experimenting with their AI. They have an AI DJ you can listen to that back announces songs. And again, that's sort of it's useful information, but it's not necessarily entertainment. And I think that's probably the difference initially with some of this stuff. Where that will go, I don't know. I don't see it particularly replacing presenters, but presenters, as you hear on Radio 1 or Capital or things like that, but for spin-off services, for more bespoke services, for personalization, for localization, I think AI is very usable now, and obviously will only get sort of even better. Of course, all the video stuff's looking good too now, though I still think it's an element of sort of uncanny valley and sort of the cheaper end of video production. You can see kind of people starting to use it. It's not quite going to replace Ant and Dec yet on the telly. But yeah, I think there's a lot of opportunity with it, and actually it can be quite enhancing. There's always quite a lot of worry, I think, about AI taking people's jobs. There's always the opportunity of that, of course. But I think actually a lot of this stuff can be potentially quite additive and improve some of the options for radio stations.
I guess particularly when presenters get later in their careers and perhaps more in need of rest, you could almost imagine someone like Stephen Fry just licensing his voice, selling it to a production company, and sitting back and relaxing on his sofa whilst the royalties roll in. But often with this sort of technology, it's normally based on a fame that was established before the technology came in. Like when Radiohead were the first to experiment with free music, they could do that because they'd already made their first million, as it were.
Well, the Stephen Fry example is the interesting one. He does lots of radio ads. And I remember when I worked at radio stations, you could tempt an advertiser by saying, hey, we can get Stephen Fry to read the ad, and they'd be kind of amazed, but actually he just sits in the studio once a week and churns out lots of them. And so actually for him to do local ads in an AI version, if it was of good enough quality and you expected it to be him, that's probably a good deal for him and a good deal for an advertiser or a radio station. So I think we'll definitely see people license their voices.
Now you're speaking in a session that's primarily focused on podcasts, but the whole day is focused on audio and radio. It's a tricky question, I guess, but what are the other big issues that we haven't already talked about that you think are keeping radio and audio industry execs awake at night at the moment?
Well, I think one of the things that we're still very fortunate for in broadcast radio is that all over Europe, nearly 90% of the population listen to some form of broadcast linear radio every week, which is phenomenal. And we're so fortunate that listeners care about the medium that much, and that you've got such talented producers making it. So that way, I think we're in a very good place. I think clearly one of the things that's changed is consumer behavior. As they move their attention to a variety of different things. So in lots of markets, we're seeing kind of some reach declines, but not like massive reach declines. But where there are declines is hours consumed. So the amount of, say, broadcast radio single stations that people listen to is dropping. And for a business that makes its money on hours or time spent listening, then that's obviously a challenge. So in the UK, you see lots of broadcasters launching spin-off services. So if people are going to switch over, they switch over to one of their brands, other brands. That's been very successful here, and lots of other European countries are taking that model. There's also a lot of opportunity around internet delivered audio, be that streaming or podcasts. Companies like Bauer are introducing ad-free internet versions, which I think is interesting. I don't think everyone will go for it, but for ad rejectors, that's a good opportunity to keep them listening. And then I think for linear broadcasters, it's about them being able to engage with the on-demand world. Linear broadcasters aren't brilliant at making podcasts. They might make shows that are based on radio shows. You see a decent amount of that. But like pure play podcasts, if you look at the charts in lots of places, particularly here in the UK, you do not see traditional radio broadcasters being high up those charts and doing well. And the broadcasters that have got into it have basically hired new people. It's not kind of existing people. They've moved across. They've hired new people. So I think all legacy broadcasters are, I think, finding that challenge a bit different, and particularly because the podcast business model and the radio business model are quite different things. Just because you make some audio doesn't mean that you can easily go from one to the other, in the same way that if you made like a B2B TV advert or video, bit of B2B video, it's not the same as making a high-end Netflix series. It's okay, it's all visual, but it's different kinds of skills, and that's the same in audio. And I think legacy broadcasters have to really think about this still relatively new medium and how they get the right talent both in front of and behind the mic to try and replicate some of the success they might have in the linear world.
Well, I'm sure there are various topics we'll be talking about in 3.5, 4 weeks' time. In the meantime, we'll see you in Nice, but thanks for taking time out today to speak to us, and we'll see you in France.
Yes, looking forward to it.